As we've seen the life and death of a plethora of live service games, the usual lesson is that many live or die off of developer support and consistent community feedback. Dead by Daylight, however, usually feels like an odd exception. DBD has definitely had its fair share of expansions and updates, but many players felt as though Behavior Interactive simply shut down most of the community voice in favor of their own vision. Some of the biggest figureheads of the community have even gone out of their way to talk about the lack of ambition or drive that BHVR can sometimes display. Usually this means that most of the talk within the community is ignored and the issues kind of just expand until they become too much to bear. While Behavior have done a slightly better job of communication in the last year or so, this almost feels more like course correction than an actual effort on their own fronts. After the release of the most divisive chapters and changes to the game, you kinda need to talk to your audience or else they're just gonna start leaving outright. We can see the abandonment and disdain from the game's community when looking at some of its worst points. A time in which the game was laden with game-breaking bugs, questionable balancing decisions, and a complete unwillingness to listen to any and all feedback presented their way. While DBD has always had a rocky history, it was from late 2020 up to the middle of 2021 that DBD was in its worst spot yet. When I mentioned 2020 as the beginning of Dead by Daylight's downward spiral, I am largely excluding the Silent Hill chapter. Far from being a failure, the Silent Hill chapter was a massive boon for the game, being among both one of the best-selling chapters and one of the all-time peaks in the game's history, player-wise. Silent Hill showed both the efforts and possibilities of BHVR, both in the designs of the characters, maps, and any future licenses that may be introduced into the game. I would argue that out of all the licenses up to Year 5, Silent Hill was actually the most well-represented. If anything, Silent Hill raised the bar for expectation far higher than any chapter prior, which is why a lot of the falters and messes with the chapters to come only feel even more disappointing. It wasn't until the next chapter, Descend Beyond, released in September 2020, that the cracks really began to form. Descend Beyond introduced Felix Richter, a relatively popular and largely inoffensive survivor, and more importantly, the Blight. The Blight, formerly Talbot Grimes, was one of the most anticipated characters within Dead by Daylight's lore community, being a character that had appeared throughout many previous lore entries and Halloween events prior to his debut as a killer. The build-up and teaser trailer of the Blight led to plenty of heightened expectations for what the killer could be, expectations which began to waver as his power and chapter were slowly being unveiled. To say that Blight at launch was a mess would be kind of an understatement, his power initially being viewed as far too derivative of other killers like Legion, while being far too buggy and downright bad on launch. Yeah, imagine saying Blight has a bad power nowadays. Not only was the collision even worse than what we have now, but his power was unable to break pallets or walls, meaning that you would be hard countered by something as simple as pre-dropping the pallet while Blight was rushing. Most Blight tech was not discovered until far later, so he was largely just a mobility killer as well. This wouldn't be so bad in a vacuum, but on top of all of that, playing Blight himself was kinda just miserable. His camera was at the same level as his chest, meaning that you couldn't even see over most medium structures or walls, his camera being more akin to someone like the Hag, who was half the size of him. Everything just kinda felt off about playing what should have been a fairly fun killer. While other parts of his kit would be hotfixed over the coming weeks and months, it was not until March 2021, 6 months after his release, that Blight actually got a camera view that was largely tolerable. The Blight also came with one of the most controversial and powerful killer perks in history, Hex Undying. While current Undying is still used occasionally, old Undying was a totally different beast. Instead of Undying replacing a broken Hex totem, the perk would transfer any broken Hex totem to another dull totem anywhere on the map. This meant that you would have to cleanse anywhere from 2 to 5 Hex totems per match depending on luck. Most Hex perks at the time weren't very good, but it just so happened that Hex, Ruin, and Undying synergized perfectly. Ruin was already an immensely popular perk within the meta, and I recommend a video by Arditha to get a true scope of Ruin's history. But the important part is that with Undying, Ruin could oftentimes last the entire match without survivors being able to do a damn thing about it. At most, you could bring a map or some perks to hope you get Undying and Ruin out quickly, but that also then gimps the rest of your loadout. With the introduction of Undying came the Ruin Undying meta, one which would last all the way until Ruin was finally nerfed in mid-2022, 2 years after the release of Blight. While the Ruin Undying combo wasn't necessarily overpowered on killers such as Trapper, Clown, or Wraith, it was mobile high-tier killers like Nurse or Spear who took full advantage and made playing the game just a functional nightmare. Undying, despite facing some nerfs, would still be considered a relatively popular option for any totem-based builds to this day. In many ways, Descend Beyond was one of the most influential chapters of DBD, both for the aforementioned changes and additions to the meta, as well as the start of the Realm Beyond initiative. Dead by Daylight was a very different looking game prior to Descend Beyond. With the game being 4 years old, many of the graphics and textures kinda just looking outdated for a game that was about to release on next-gen platforms. Realm Beyond updated many of the textures, character models, and maps within the game to give it a new, fresh feeling. What was an unfortunate side effect of this initiative, however, was arguably one of the biggest sore spots the game still feels today. As the team developing maps had to rebalance many of the old maps in the game, we were no longer getting new releases with each chapter. This meant that Silent Hill would have the only map release for the entire year, with us still not always being guaranteed a new map as BHVR continued to update and fix old maps with certain chapter releases, including maps already addressed by the Realm Beyond initiative. While the updated maps did look prettier, the game quickly began to feel staler and staler with each upcoming patch because the gameplay changes were not significant enough to make the maps truly feel different from before. In my personal opinion, Realm Beyond contributed the most to the stale feeling that DBD still has even after all these years, with maps being one of the most important ways to liven up the game's feel. While new killers and new survivor perks are welcome to freshen up gameplay, people just go back to their mains after the honeymoon phase of a chapter. The only exceptions being when truly powerful perks or killers come out, meaning we're once again playing on the same maps with maybe 1 or 2 extra killers added. Even after all this time, certain maps remain uncontroversial and unliked, with community sentiment around map balancing continuing to be a sore subject that hasn't really even been fully addressed. Up to this point, I've largely avoided talking about bugs, but this will actually be one of the most pervasive themes throughout Year 4 of Dead by Daylight. I'll be the first to agree with the sentiment that DBD is an extremely buggy game, but I would also be the first to argue that the level of QA and bug fixes were somehow even worse than it is nowadays. The amount of game-breaking bugs introduced in patch 4.2.0 was honestly laughable, with bugs such as the inability to hear the killer's heartbeat, occasionally just kind of getting stuck in a hill for no reason, decisive strikes stunning certain killers for a fraction of the time, or sometimes just not being able to hook survivors. Bug totem spawns, bug perks, plenty of frame drops for console players. It was hard to not encounter at least a bug per match at the time. It ended up giving a little primer into a lot of the issues that would plague the game for the coming months and arguably still to this day. A lot of the issues with Descend Beyond would also repeat in future releases, with the obvious one being the lack of maps and general lack of bug testing. The September mid-chapter came and went without too many important changes. It wasn't until the next chapter, A Binding of Kin, that the dam truly burst for behavior. A Binding of Kin introduced LED Rakota with no real impactful perks and changes, and the twins. You'd be hard-pressed to find a single person who didn't think launch twins were just kind of a disaster. More than any killer prior to or since then, the twins were fundamentally broken in a finish in a way that no other killer has been. While Legion or Skull Merchant at launch may be extremely unfun or painful to go against, the twins were broken in a completely different fashion. To list off just a few of the bugs with the power, Victor would sometimes get stuck in the floor arbitrarily, or just freeze and be unable to move.
I think that's GG, but I don't know if I get Merc. Are you kidding me? They didn't fix this.
Being unable to block people from leaving, or just randomly colliding with the air, which is still a problem to this day. Switching between Charlotte and Victor too fast would make your screen just go black. 5 of the 6 perks released were bugged on launch. Trying to play twins felt almost like you were punishing yourself, and the worst part is that most of this feedback was given during the PTB. By no means would it be easy to fix all these issues within the 3 weeks from the PTB to live servers, but the complete lack of acknowledgement or communication from the developers honestly made it feel as though they were fine releasing an unfinished product for money. It's honestly baffling to me that many of these problems weren't already squashed during the QA phase, and it was this chapter release that heavily pushed the idea that BHVR just doesn't test the game. I was lucky enough to not have to actually spend money on this chapter through having enough iridescent shirts through grinding, but not everyone had that luxury, and many shelled out the $7 for something that could have just been delayed a week and been better off for it. The launch of The Binding of Kin is still panned as one of, if not the worst chapter releases BHVR ever put out. I see a lot of people malign Skull Merchant in her release for very good reason, but for better or worse, the killer was at least functional through release. Through a variety of hotfixes, the twins would eventually reach a playable state and a new med chapter would come along. The patch following the twins has forever been ingrained in DBD's history for all the wrong reasons. The clown was finally given some attention when he was finally given the antidote bottles, a change which ultimately did very little to help an underperforming killer while also cementing the fact that BHVR will probably never buff him in a way that matters. The most memorable part of the update was the new UI, updated in order to... I actually don't know what the new UI was meant to achieve. What ended up happening was that most of the UI elements were spread across the corners of the screen, leading to information being far too scattered and hard to read at a moment's notice. As has seemingly become tradition at this point, despite the very public outcry against the new UI changes, it went live without any adjustments, being changed to the current UI a month later when the entire community collectively shit all over the old one.
You didn't like it that much, did you, Odds? I mean, no offense, dude, but I've just been telling you guys for like 3 weeks straight that I am not the biggest fan now. So I'm starting to just sound like a broken record.
So I think what they should do is take the new positive things they added, which is the hook indicator and the portraits, and just simply add it to the existing UI.
Along with the UI changes also came a host of animation changes for Survivor, which was met with mixed responses while also breaking a lot of Survivor movements for the worst. Turning, crouching, and running all felt sluggish and awkward compared to the old animations, and it would only be a few patches before we got a middle ground between the old movement and new animations, though again you have to ask why didn't they do this in the first place instead of releasing something that no one liked. For the most part I've avoided talking about maps themselves since I just don't believe many of the changes changes were truly that important. Maps like Badham Preschool and McMillan Estate were basically about as balanced as they were before, though not necessarily a good thing in Badham's case. This changed with the reintroduction of Gideon Meat Plant. The game actually used to be a relatively killer-sided map, with some decent or safe pallets offset by the fact that it was immensely small and really easy to navigate for any killer. This changed in the February PTB, as the game was updated to its current survivor-sided iteration. This map is still pretty heinous to play on either side of the perspective if you ask me, and I just kind of always find it a little bit miserable to go on every time.
This palette is completely new, by the way. Oh! What? How did they... Why did they get this? Hello? Okay. Holy shit, this is like the safest palette in the game? Okay. I don't know if that was necessary, dude. Don't get me wrong, this is not a horrible killer map, but...
Don't worry, the suffering was not all on the killer side, as this patch also introduced one of the worst bugs for survivors. Somehow, in nearly every match, survivors and killers would become desync, meaning that the server would feed information to the two sides in different ways. What this translated to is that killers would often be a lot closer to survivors than they were appearing to be, leading to people getting hit over pallets at long ranges, or characters sometimes just teleporting around. More than any other mid-chapter, this one was honestly painful on both sides, sandwiched between the buggiest chapter released before it and one of the most controversial releases afterwards. With all of these releases in the past year containing some new hosts of bugs, glitches, or underperforming killers, tensions were certainly high within the DBD community. Up to this point in the game's history, there wasn't really a consistent string of bad patches or releases. The game was always flawed, but typically going up in quality overall. Previous years also had the excuse for the quality, such as the game being fairly new, or BHVR needing to listen to the demands of licensors. 2020 had neither of these reasons to fall back on, and the downward trend would sadly last. The final chapter of Year 4 was All Kill, which featured Undying and the ever-infamous Trickster, where most, if not all, chapters of DBD followed some sort of easily identifiable horror theme formula: slashers, ghosts, hex magic, or just people eventually turning evil over time. All Kill was much more difficult for fans to wrap their heads around. A K-pop chapter where the killer was just kind of like a guy was the last thing expected with all the promo leading up to it. More than any chapter I can remember, at least up to the current All Things Wicked chapter, All Kill had all sorts of speculation based around the teasers. Some people believing the killer could rewind time, or speculation that Undying was the killer due to blacked out teaser images. Hell, some people thought it would be some kind of robot killer or like a siren or something.
So, on the face of it, it looks as if the killer would have a rewind power of some sort. Usually things are not what they seem in Dead by Daylight, so it's possible that it is a rewind power. By the way, I've been loving all of the theories that y'all have been throwing at me about different things, like the magnum opus is actually an artificial intelligence creation. The survivor is going to be like a K-pop star or some media celebrity, and the killer is going to be their stalker. Maybe it isn't a rewind power at all. This hidden message possibly means that the killer is going to be a singer of some sort, and they're going to be able to use their voice as their power.
But it does leave a lot of more speculation where people are saying either the survivor or the killer definitely has to do with something with glitches. Obviously, we saw the glitchy logo, and then they got hacked. And this is what a lot of people speculated, that the power or maybe the survivor is going to have roots in or heritages in or that. And this is also what we theorized earlier on in today's video, saying that if it is an original killer, this can likely be the power. Maybe it affects generators and they can glitch it out, or some of your equipment, or whatever the case may be.
And in the end, all these teasers and speculation led to a killer who threw knives. It was hard not to be disappointed given how much buildup there was for a unique killer power. His power was seen as an inferior version of Huntress or Plague, though this could also be partly due to people over-speculating on killer powers based on teasers alone. All this is somewhat superfluous though, since what matters most about a killer's release is if they're fun to play and decently balanced. So it hurts me to say that the Trickster was launched as one of, if not the weakest killer in the whole game during the time. It took more knives to hurt survivors, he had zero map pressure, and very little snowball potential with his power being much slower to use than it is nowadays. Main event, his super ability, was a hindrance more often than not, taking forever to start up, being slower both in main event and while throwing knives, and having a dreadfully long cooldown once main event was actually over. You'd spend several chases trying to build up this insane power spike, only to realistically down one survivor at best, and injure someone before they ran away at worst.
I hit 2 people. Nice. Huge snowball. That was like a perfect use of my power too. Like the maximum potential that his power has. And we injured some people.
After a myriad of disappointing releases and patches, Trickster was just another in the long line of mediocrity which plagued the entire year. Once again, All Kill came with no map release, which stung extra hard because most players agreed they would love a map set in the metropolitan aesthetic of the main menu lobby we got during the chapter's release. While Trickster would get buffed slightly in a bug fix patch and receive further buffs in the upcoming mid-chapter, many of his core design flaws never really changed, even after so many changes, showing that even the dev team doesn't really know what to do with him. With the release of All Kill, year 4 of DBD started with a bang, which seemed to burn itself out as BHVR limped throughout the rest of the year. It's really easy to look at more recent happenings in a negative light, so I think many people would say year 7 was a low light of DBD. The chief difference between year 4 and year 7 is that for as absolutely mediocre as the Knight and the Skull Merchant were, problems tended to stop at the killer. Year 4 had so many fundamental issues that it's hard to even remember if anything good came out of that time period. I didn't even get into the reworks of Leatherface and Hillbilly, which made Bubba viable for the first time while kneecapping Hillbilly for the next 4 years. Whether it be the meta, the game-breaking bugs, or just absolutely abhorrent killer releases, it almost felt like the game was going to continue to limp along to the finish line. This was until the mid-chapter following All Kill, which I actually believe was largely positive due to a handful of changes to problematic perks such as Object of Obsession, or awful killer add-on combos such as Forever Freddy or Iridescent Head Huntress. It was a sign of things slowly but surely taking a positive turn for the game despite the wrinkles of the last year. I'm gonna be honest, I wrote the rough script for this video back in 2022, at the time when cheaters were absolutely rampant and BHVR was bafflingly silent about any circumstances negatively affecting the game. 2022 was an odd year which simultaneously had quite a few fun chapters and memories, while also being the worst the BHVR had ever been at quelling the community sentiment, worsened by the release of Skull Merchant. My reason for making this video is different than what it used to be 2 years ago. BHVR has finally learned how to communicate, but the future of this game has never felt so boring. Chapter releases have been good for the most part, but there's a certain sense throughout the year that BHVR has very little ambition towards really innovating on the game in a meaningful way. It's a meme at this point that during every single Q&A BHVR put out, they tend to respond to every question with a non-answer, saying that they have plans for the future or like certain ideas without ever following up on if they're actually going to be implemented.
And I have to, what is the point of having questions answered if they're all answered in the exact same way? We know what you're talking about is an issue, but we don't have a concrete time frame on when we're going to fix that. That's, no joke, 90% of the answers were just that. So what is the point of actually doing these to begin with?
Alternatively, changes which should have already been made at this point, like allowing players to inspect their teammates' builds, a feature which already exists in DBD Mobile, or reworking killers that are absolutely outdated and miserable to play, are just left for years down the road.
Gradually, and you should see some improvements over the next years. Smiley face. This, I share the sentiment. Years? What do you mean years?
Killers like Hillbilly finally got touched after existing in an abysmal state for half of the game's lifespan. But we also have basically no clue on when Freddy will ever be changed. Buffs go through on killers who need it like Trickster or Pig, but then Sadako and Huntress get the most baffling buffs or changes, which just kind of make them miserable to play against. I know devs don't have infinite resources to touch on all these aspects, but I also have no clue how some of this stuff gets put on the back burner for so long that I can't even remember if they actually ever talk about changing them or not. Don't worry though, we're gonna get plenty of skin sets and aesthetics while the new event doesn't even have a functional offering. Don't even get started on the fact that the currently previewed Twins rework might end up making them even more annoying to play against and even more bafflingly broken.
Like, you run, for example. Right? Okay, now there shouldn't be any problem. Like, you can't go into locker because at this, with Coachella this close, I will find him. Oh, nice Adren! Very nice Adren, guys. Wow, that's incredible, actually. That's amazing. Guys, well done.
In my old script, I wrote, the lack of communication and general silence from BHVR has been telling. And while BHVR has never been a company to truly discuss feedback publicly, I can't help but wonder if it's going to be the catalyst towards another awful period in the game. In some ways, I was wrong, since the communication actually has improved overall. What I think ended up being the true catalyst for mediocrity is the fact that BHVR's ideas for innovation take months or years to actually end up being implemented, leaving me playing the same game I've already sunk 3 years and 2,800 hours on. The only thing keeping me invested for that long was the ability to easily play with my friends for hours at a time, and once those friends moved on or we went on to different games, the hamster wheel really became obvious for me. I want to love Dead by Daylight. I've invested so much time and energy and money into this game, into the content creators, and into enjoying what has been put out. But if the only thing we're ever gonna get are mediocre new game modes that barely change the game, then I don't see any point in even bothering to still keep playing the damn game. I was able to enjoy this game during all of the awful patches and weird ass releases, but what I actually come back to with this game is that the thing that will kill Dead by Daylight is not competition or mediocre releases, it's just behavior themselves. As the video wraps up, I wanted to ask all of you about what your current takes are on Dead by Daylight and how much you really feel invested in it nowadays. How long have you been playing, and have you taken a substantial break recently or in the past? If you disagree with my take completely or want to discuss the current state of DBD, then I'm more than happy to talk about that in the comments. I do genuinely want to like playing the game now, even if I haven't really been able to for a while. I also want to make a note that I'm considering streaming on this channel in the near future, primarily focusing on games I've never played before and kind of want to make a video on potentially. I'll be posting stream announcements on my Twitter, but if you would like to keep up to date with all videos and streams, and just subscribe for more content. I look forward to hearing from you all, and have a good one.